The mountain man stood in the doorway of his cabin watching snowflakes drift past his face, not feeling the cold that would send most men running for shelter, when he spotted something impossible moving through the white expanse below. His hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the doorframe, but his finger stayed off the trigger when he realized the shape stumbling through knee-deep snow was a woman, alone, without a horse, and barely standing. It was 1876, and up here in the mountains west of Carson City, Nevada, winter showed no mercy to fools or the desperate. Duncan Wright had lived alone in these mountains for 8 years, ever since he returned from the war and found he preferred the company of trees and silence to the noise of civilization. At 32, his body had turned into corded muscle and raw strength from years of chopping wood, hauling water, and surviving winters that broke weaker men. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, usually tied back with a strip of leather, and his beard was thick enough to keep his face warm in the coldest weather. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer down the mountain without breaking stride. Most people who saw him in town during his rare visits crossed to the other side of the street. But now he was moving faster than he had in months, his long legs covering the distance between his cabin and the struggling figure in moments. She collapsed just as he reached her, falling face first into a drift that would have buried her if he had not been there. Duncan scooped her up as easily as picking up a sack of flour, feeling how light she was even through the layers of inadequate clothing she wore. Her lips were blue, her face pale as death, and ice clung to her dark hair. He did not waste time with questions. Duncan carried her back to the cabin, kicked the door shut behind them, and laid her on the thick bearskin rug in front of his fireplace. The fire was already roaring, as he kept it burning day and night during winter. He worked quickly, removing her frozen boots and the thin coat that had done nothing to protect her. Her dress beneath was threadbare and patched in multiple places, the kind of clothing worn by someone who had nothing else. Her hands were red and swollen with the beginning of frostbite. Duncan wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then added his own buffalo hide for good measure. He heated water on the stove and carefully warmed her hands and feet, knowing that warming her too quickly could cause as much damage as the cold itself. She was young, probably not more than 20 or 21, with delicate features that would have been pretty if they were not currently the color of ice. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and he took that as a good sign. It was nearly an hour before her eyelids fluttered, and she made a small sound. Duncan was sitting beside her, monitoring her condition with the same careful attention he gave to everything necessary for survival. When her eyes finally opened, they were the color of honey, wide and confused and terrified all at once. "Easy," he said, his voice rougher than he intended from lack of use. "You are safe." She tried to sit up, but he put a gentle hand on her shoulder to keep her down. Despite the gentleness, she flinched, and he saw something flash through her eyes that he recognized. Fear. Not of the cold or the mountains or even death, but of another person. He had seen that look before in the eyes of cornered animals. "My name is Duncan Wright," he told her, pulling his hand back and giving her space. "This is my cabin. You were freezing to death in the snow. I brought you inside." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could practically see her mind working through her options and finding none. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper and rough from the cold. "Thank you." "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, and he wondered if she would lie. But then she said, "Hannah, Hannah Edwards." "Hannah, what in the name of all that is holy were you doing walking through a blizzard in the mountains?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. Then words started spilling out of her like water from a cracked dam. I was running from my husband, former husband. He died 3 days ago, but his brother came to the house and said I owed him everything Joseph had owned, including me. Said I was property now, and that I would do what I was told, or he would make me regret ever being born. So I ran. I knew he would come after me, so I kept going. I thought if I could get far enough away, maybe to California, I could find work. Start over. I did not realize how far into the mountains the road would take me, or that the snow would get so bad so fast. Duncan listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral. Your husband's brother cannot claim you as property. That is not how the law works, she laughed, but there was no humor in it. The law does not care much about women like me. Joseph made sure everyone knew I came from nothing, that he had done me a great favor by marrying me. His brother is friends with the sheriff. Who do you think they would believe? Duncan could not argue with that. He had seen enough of the world to know that justice was often more about who had money and connections than what was actually right. How long were you married? 2 years. Joseph was 43 when he married me. I was 18. My father owed him money, and Joseph said he would forgive the debt if I married him. My father was dying and we had no way to pay, so I agreed. She said it matter-of-factly, as if selling herself to pay a debt was as normal as buying flour from the general store. Duncan felt anger stir in his chest, not at her, but at a world that forced young women into such choices. He stood up, needing to move. Are you hungry? Starving, she admitted. He went to his small kitchen area and started preparing food. Duncan was not much of a cook, but he could make a decent stew, and he had smoked venison and potatoes. As he worked, he was aware of Hannah watching him from her nest of blankets. He must have looked like something out of a nightmare to her, this huge bearded man in the middle of nowhere who had pulled her out of the snow. He could hardly blame her for being wary. When the stew was ready, he brought her a bowl and a spoon. She sat up slowly, keeping the blankets wrapped around her, and took the food with both hands. She ate like someone who had not seen a proper meal in days, which was probably true. Duncan gave her all the time she needed, then refilled her bowl when she finished. She ate 3 bowls before she finally stopped and looked at him with something like embarrassment. I am sorry, she said. I have not eaten since yesterday morning, and even then it was just some bread I had in my bag. Do not apologize for being hungry, Duncan said. You need to eat to recover from the cold. She looked around the cabin properly for the first time, taking in the single large room with its stone fireplace, the narrow bed in one corner, the small kitchen area, and the various animal hides hanging on the walls. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves holding supplies and tools, and very little else. It was the home of a man who lived simply and alone. Is there a town nearby? Hannah asked. Somewhere I could find work. Carson City is a day's ride down the mountain, weather permitting, Duncan said. But that storm outside is not going to let up for at least another 2 days, maybe 3. You are stuck here for now. He watched panic flash across her face. I cannot stay here. If Joseph's brother tracks me, he will find me. He will kill you and take me back. Duncan almost smiled at that. Almost. If your former brother-in-law comes up this mountain looking for you, he is welcome to try whatever he likes. I have been dealing with threats since before you were born, Hannah. I am not worried about one man with delusions of ownership. She studied him with those honey-colored eyes, seeming to really see him for the first time. He knew what she saw. A man who looked more animal than civilized, scarred and weathered and hard as the mountains themselves. He also knew that despite his frightening appearance, he had not hurt her. He had saved her life and fed her and given her his blankets. That had to count for something. Why do you live up here alone? she asked. It was a fair question, given that she was trapped in his home. "I like the quiet," he said simply. "And I got tired of people telling me what to do and how to live. Up here, the only rules are the ones that keep you alive." Hannah nodded as if that made perfect sense. "I think I understand that better than I did 3 days ago." The storm howled outside, rattling the shutters Duncan had put over the windows. He stood and checked the fire, adding more wood to keep it burning hot. "You should rest," he told her. "Your body needs time to recover. You can have the bed. I will sleep by the fire." "This is your home," Hannah protested. "I cannot take your bed." "You can and you will," Duncan said in a tone that brooked no argument. "The bed has real mattress and blankets. The floor by the fire is fine for me. I have slept in worse places." She looked like she wanted to argue more but was too exhausted to find the words. Duncan helped her to the bed, still wrapped in blankets, and she was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. He stood watching her for a moment, this unexpected person who had stumbled into his carefully ordered life, then returned to the fire. The storm lasted 3 full days, just as Duncan had predicted. During that time, he and Hannah settled into a careful routine. He would wake before dawn, as always, and build up the fire. He would make coffee and whatever passed for breakfast, usually eggs from the chickens he kept in a small coop attached to the cabin or cornmeal mush with honey. Hannah would wake soon after, and they would eat together in relative silence. During the day, Duncan did his usual chores, feeding the chickens, checking his traps, bringing in more wood, and maintaining his equipment. Hannah watched at first, still weak from her ordeal, but by the second day she was starting to move around the cabin. She cleaned without being asked, organizing his supplies with an efficiency that suggested she had spent her married life trying to keep house for a man who likely criticized everything she did. On the 3rd day, Hannah made a discovery that changed something between them. Duncan had gone out to check the chicken coop, fighting through snow that was finally starting to ease. When he came back inside, stamping snow off his boots, he found Hannah standing in the corner where he kept his supplies, holding up a pile of empty feed sacks made of printed cotton fabric. "Do you need these?" she asked, her eyes bright with an idea. Duncan looked at the pile of sacks. They were made of cheap cotton printed with simple patterns, flowers and stripes and geometric shapes, the kind of thing that feed companies used to make their products look more appealing to farmers' wives. He had saved them because he was in the habit of saving everything that might be useful, but he had no specific plan for them. "No," he said. "Why?" Hannah held up one of the sacks, smoothing out the wrinkles. "I could make curtains," she said. "Your windows have shutters but no curtains. It would help keep the cold out, and it would make the cabin feel more like a home." Duncan looked around his cabin, seeing it suddenly through her eyes. It was clean and functional, everything in its place, but it was also stark and bare. He had never thought about things like curtains or decoration. They served no practical purpose. But the way Hannah was looking at those feed sacks, with excitement and hope and something like purpose, made him reconsider. "If you want to make curtains, go ahead," he said. Her whole face lit up. It was the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her entirely. "You have needle and thread." He did, as it turned out, because he sometimes needed to repair his own clothes or fix torn hides. The supplies were basic, but Hannah looked at them like they were treasure. She immediately set to work, carefully unpicking the seams of the feed sacks to get the largest possible pieces of fabric, then washing them in heated water to remove any remaining traces of grain and dust. Duncan watched her work while he tended to his own tasks. She was completely focused, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She had done this kind of work before, probably out of necessity. Women like Hannah, who came from nothing and married for survival, learned to make something out of less than nothing. They darned socks until there was more darn than sock, turned collars on shirts to extend their life, and made dresses out of flour sacks because real fabric was too expensive. "Joseph never let me sew anything decorative," Hannah said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "He said it was a waste of time and materials. Everything had to be practical, useful. I used to see the feed sacks in the barn and think about what I could make with them, but I knew he would be angry if I took them without permission. And if I asked permission, he would say no just because he could." Duncan felt that anger stir again, the same rage he had felt when she first told him about her marriage. "He sounds like he was a miserable son of a bitch." Hannah's hand stilled for a moment, then she laughed, a real laugh this time, bright and surprised. "He was," she agreed. "He was absolutely miserable, and he made sure everyone around him was miserable too. I know I should not speak ill of the dead, but I cannot find it in myself to mourn him. Does that make me a terrible person?" "No," Duncan said firmly. "It makes you honest." She looked at him with those honey eyes, and something passed between them, some understanding that did not need words. They were both people who had been shaped by hard circumstances, who had survived things that should have broken them, and who had learned that sometimes survival meant leaving behind the people and places that hurt you. That night, after a dinner of venison stew and the last of Duncan's sourdough bread, Hannah continued working on the curtains by firelight. Duncan sat at the table, working on repairing a leather harness, but he found his attention drifting to her. In the warm glow of the fire, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her face soft with concentration, she looked nothing like the half-frozen woman he had pulled from the snow. She looked alive and present, and real in a way that made his cabin feel different. "Tell me about this place," Hannah said, glancing up from her sewing. "How did you find it?" Duncan considered the question. He was not used to talking about himself, but something about the quiet intimacy of the evening made him willing to share. "I came west after the war," he said. "I had spent 4 years taking orders and living in camps and watching good men die for reasons I still do not fully understand. When it was over, I just started walking. I worked odd jobs, saved money, and kept moving until I found a place where I could not hear anything but wind and birds. This mountain was as far as I could go before running out of land, so I stopped here, built the cabin with my own hands, been here ever since." "Do you ever get lonely?" Hannah asked. "Sometimes," Duncan admitted, "but loneliness is better than being around people who make you feel worse. At least when you are alone, you only have yourself to blame for your problems." Hannah nodded slowly. "I think I am going to learn that lesson. I have spent so long living according to what other people wanted from me that I do not know who I am when no one is telling me what to do." "Then maybe this is your chance to find out," Duncan said. She met his eyes across the cabin, and something warm unfurled in Duncan's chest, something he had not felt in so long he almost did not recognize it. It was not desire, though he would be lying if he said he had not noticed that Hannah was beautiful. It was something deeper and more dangerous than simple attraction. It was the beginning of caring what happened to another person. The storm finally broke on the 4th day. Duncan woke to silence, the kind of complete quiet that only comes after heavy snow, when the world is muffled and still. He rose from his bedroll by the fire and looked out the window to see clear sky and deep drifts covering everything in sight. It would be days before the trail down the mountain was passable, but at least the immediate danger had passed. Hannah was still asleep in the bed, buried under blankets with just the top of her head visible. Duncan made coffee and started breakfast, letting the sounds of morning gently wake her. When she finally emerged, her hair was a tangled mess, and her face was soft with sleep. She looked younger than her 20 years, vulnerable in a way that made Duncan want to build walls around her to keep the rest of the world out. "The storm stopped," he told her, handing her a cup of coffee. She took it gratefully, wrapping both hands around the tin mug. "Does that mean I should leave?" The question hung in the air between them. Duncan knew the practical answer. He should take her down to Carson City as soon as the trail was clear, help her find work and lodging, and then return to his solitary life. That was what made sense. But the thought of watching her walk away made him feel something uncomfortably close to loss. "The trail will not be clear for at least a few more days," he said, avoiding the real question. "And even then, you will need proper winter clothes before you go anywhere. What you were wearing would not keep a dog warm." Hannah looked down at the borrowed shirt and pants she was wearing, Duncan's spare clothes that she had belted tight to keep from falling off her smaller frame. "I do not have money for new clothes." "I did not ask if you had money," Duncan said. "I have hides and furs. I can make you something that will last." She stared at him as if he had just offered her a palace made of gold. "Why would you do that?" "Because letting you freeze to death after I already saved you once would be stupid," Duncan said bluntly. It was not the real reason, and they both knew it. But it was easier than admitting that he was already dreading the moment she left. Over the next several days, they fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Duncan worked on making Hannah a proper winter coat from deer hide, carefully cutting and sewing the pieces with the same attention he gave to everything. Hannah finished the curtains and hung them over the windows, transforming the cabin in a way that Duncan could not quite articulate. The fabric softened the hard edges of the room, and the patterns added color and life to spaces that had been nothing but wood and stone. But it was more than just the curtains. Hannah had started cooking meals that were more than just functional fuel. She took Duncan's basic ingredients and turned them into food that tasted like something worth eating. She organized the cabin in ways that made sense, putting things where they were easy to reach instead of where they happened to fit. She hummed while she worked, soft, wordless melodies that filled the silence. For the first time in 8 years, Duncan's cabin felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. He caught himself watching her at odd moments. The way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when it fell in her face. The way she smiled when she accomplished something, as if every small success was a victory worth celebrating. She moved through his space with increasing confidence, no longer flinching when he came too close or spoke too suddenly. One evening, about a week after she arrived, Duncan was working on her coat while Hannah prepared dinner. The cabin smelled like roasting meat and herbs, and the curtains she had made glowed warm in the firelight. She was singing quietly, something he thought might have been a hymn, and the sound wrapped around him like a blanket. "You have a nice voice," he said, the words out before he could think better of them. Hannah turned, surprised. "My mother used to sing," she said, "before she died." "I do not remember much about her, but I remember her singing while she worked. I think it made the work feel less hard." "How old were you when she died?" 7. "It was cholera. She died and my father fell apart. He never really recovered. Started drinking, lost his business, got in debt. By the time he died when I was 18, there was nothing left except what he owed Joseph." Duncan heard what she was not saying, that her whole life had been shaped by loss and obligation, that she had never been given the chance to choose anything for herself. "What would you have done if you could have chosen?" he asked. Hannah was quiet for a long moment, stirring the pot on the stove. "I do not know," she finally admitted. "I never let myself think about it because thinking about impossible things just makes you sad. But sometimes I would see women in town who ran their own businesses, seamstresses or bakers or laundresses, and I would wonder what that felt like. To work hard and keep what you earned. To answer to no one but yourself. You could still do that, Duncan said. You are good with your hands. You could take in sewing in Carson City, build a business. She smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. Maybe. If Joseph's brother does not find me first. Duncan felt his hands tighten on the hide he was working. Has he ever been to Carson City? I do not think so. We lived in Virginia City. Joseph's brother, Marcus, worked in the mines there. He did not travel much. Then he would have no reason to look for you in Carson City, Duncan reasoned. You could use a different name if you wanted, start fresh where no one knows you. Hannah turned to look at him fully, her expression unreadable. You have really thought about this. He had more than he wanted to admit. I just want you to be safe. Something shifted in her expression, something soft and wondering. Why do you care so much about what happens to me? You do not know me. I am just some woman who nearly died on your mountain. Duncan met her eyes. You are not just some woman. You are someone who survived something terrible and still found the strength to run toward an uncertain future instead of accepting what you were told you deserved. That takes courage. Real courage, not the kind men talk about in taverns. And you made my cabin feel different, better. I have lived here for 8 years and I never once thought about curtains, but now that they are there, I cannot imagine the place without them. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Duncan thought he had said the wrong thing. But then she was crossing the cabin in quick steps, and before he could react, she was hugging him. It was awkward because he was sitting and she was standing, and he still had the leather and tools in his hands, but her arms went around his neck, and her face pressed against his shoulder, and Duncan felt something crack open inside his chest. He set down his work carefully and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her closer. She was so small against him, the top of her head barely reaching his chin, but she held on tight as if he was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to sweep her away. He could feel her shaking, feel the wetness of tears against his shirt, and he just held her, letting her take whatever comfort she needed. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for seeing me as more than just something to be used or thrown away. Thank you for treating me like a person." "You are a person," Duncan said, his voice rough. "Anyone who treated you as less than that was a fool." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and the expression on her face made his heart pound. Before he could analyze what was happening, Hannah stretched up on her toes and kissed him. It was soft and tentative, a question more than a demand, and Duncan froze for half a heartbeat before he responded. He kissed her back gently, one hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his fingers threading through her dark hair. She made a small sound and pressed closer, and Duncan felt desire surge through him hot and urgent. But he forced himself to stay gentle, to keep control, because Hannah had spent 2 years married to a man who took what he wanted without caring what she needed. Duncan would be damned before he became another man who used her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Duncan rested his forehead against hers. "Hannah," he said, his voice strained, "I need you to be sure about this. I need to know this is what you want, not just gratitude or fear of being alone." She cupped his face in both hands, her honey eyes fierce. "I want this. I want you. For the first time in my life, I am choosing something for myself, and I choose you." That was all Duncan needed to hear. He stood, lifting her with him, and carried her to the bed. He laid her down gently and followed her onto the rough mattress, caging her body with his much larger one. "If you want me to stop at any point, you say so," he told her. "Promise me." "I promise," Hannah whispered, reaching up to pull him down into another kiss. Duncan made love to her slowly, carefully, paying attention to every sound and reaction. He explored her body with reverent hands, learning what made her gasp and sigh, what made her arch against him. Hannah responded with a passion that surprised them both, her own hands roaming over the hard planes of his chest and shoulders, marveling at the strength she found there. When he finally joined their bodies, moving with exquisite gentleness, she clung to him and buried her face against his neck, and Duncan felt something in his chest expand until he thought it might burst. Afterwards, they lay tangled together under the blankets, Hannah's head on Duncan's chest and his arm around her shoulders. The fire crackled in the background, and the cabin felt warmer than ever, filled with a peace that Duncan had not known existed. "I did not know it could be like that," Hannah said softly, tracing patterns on his chest with one finger. "Joseph never cared if I enjoyed it. He just took what he wanted and then went to sleep." Duncan's jaw tightened, but he forced his voice to stay calm. That was not making love. That was just him being selfish. It should always be about both people. Hannah propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her hair falling in waves around her face. "How did you learn that? Most men do not seem to care." "My mother raised me to respect women," Duncan said. "And I have known enough men who treated women badly to know I never wanted to be like them. You deserve to be cherished, Hannah. Every woman does, but especially you." She kissed him again, soft and sweet, and then settled back against his chest. "I think I am falling in love with you," she whispered, the words almost too quiet to hear. Duncan's heart stuttered in his chest. He had not expected that, had not let himself hope for it, but hearing her say it made him realize how much he had wanted to hear those words. "I think I am falling in love with you too," he admitted. "I did not plan on it, I was happy alone, but then you showed up and everything changed." "Is that a bad thing?" Hannah asked, a note of worry in her voice. "No," Duncan said firmly, pulling her closer. "It is the best thing that has happened to me in longer than I can remember." They stayed in bed the rest of the evening, talking and touching and learning each other. Duncan told her about his childhood on a farm in Pennsylvania, about the war that had stolen 4 years of his life, about the long journey west, and the peace he had found in these mountains. Hannah told him about her mother's death, about her father's decline, about the 2 years she spent married to a man who saw her as property instead of a partner. "I used to dream about running away," Hannah confessed, "but I had nowhere to go and no money. Joseph controlled everything. He gave me just enough to buy food at the general store, and he always wanted to see receipts so he knew I was not keeping anything for myself. I felt like I was in prison, except prisons eventually let you go." "You are free now," Duncan said, running his fingers through her hair. "You never have to go back to that life." "But I do have to leave here eventually," Hannah said, and the sadness in her voice cut through Duncan like a knife. "I cannot stay in your cabin forever, taking your food and your space. You have a life here, and I need to build one of my own." Duncan was quiet for a long moment. The thought of Hannah leaving, of going back to an empty cabin after having her here, filled him with a dread he could not name. But he also knew she was right. She needed to build her own life, make her own choices, not just trade one man's protection for another's. "What if you did not have to leave?" he finally said, the words coming out before he could second-guess them. Hannah went very still against him. "What do you mean? I mean stay here." "With me. Not as a guest or someone taking charity, but as my wife. Build a life here together." She sat up abruptly, staring at him with wide eyes. "Duncan, we have only known each other for a week." "I know," he said, sitting up as well. "And if you want time to think about it, I understand. But I also know that I have lived alone in this cabin for 8 years, and in 1 week, you have made it feel more like a home than it ever did. I know that, when I think about you leaving, something in me rebels against it." And I know that you said you were falling in love with me, and I am falling in love with you, and sometimes when you know something is right, you just know." Hannah's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. "Are you sure? I come with complications. Joseph's brother might come looking for me. I have no money, no family, nothing to bring to a marriage except myself." "You are all I want," Duncan said simply. "And if Marcus comes looking for trouble, he will find more than he bargained for. I have lived through a war and 8 winters alone on this mountain. One angry man does not scare me." Hannah launched herself at him, knocking him back onto the bed, kissing him with joy and relief and love all mixed together. "Yes," she said between kisses. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes to everything." Duncan wrapped his arms around her and rolled them over so he was above her, grinning down at her with an expression he was certain looked foolish. "Tomorrow I will take you down to Carson City. We will find a preacher and do this properly." "What about the trail?" Hannah asked. "The sun has been shining for 2 days. The snow will be melting. We can make it down if we are careful, and I want to marry you as soon as possible before you realize you could do better." Hannah cupped his face in her hands, her expression fierce. "There is no better. There is only you." They made love again, slowly and thoroughly, and when they finally slept, wrapped around each other in the narrow bed, the cabin glowed with warmth that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with the 2 people inside it. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Duncan woke before sunrise, as always, and spent a few minutes just watching Hannah sleep. In the early light, with her face relaxed and peaceful, she looked impossibly young and beautiful. The fact that she had agreed to marry him felt like a miracle he did not deserve, but would spend the rest of his life trying to earn. He rose carefully, trying not to wake her, and started preparing for the journey down the mountain. He packed supplies, saddled his horse, and made sure the chickens had enough food and water to last a few days. When he came back inside, Hannah was awake and wearing the clothes he had finished for her. Sturdy wool pants tucked into boots he had found that were only slightly too big, a thick shirt, and the deerskin coat lined with rabbit fur. She looked practical and beautiful and ready for whatever came next. "How do I look?" she asked, spreading her arms. "Like you belong here," Duncan said honestly. They ate a quick breakfast and then set out. The trail down the mountain was treacherous with snow and ice, but Duncan's horse was sure-footed and strong. Duncan sat in the saddle with Hannah in front of him, one arm wrapped securely around her waist. She leaned back against his chest, trusting him to keep them both safe, and Duncan felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. The journey took most of the day, with Duncan carefully picking their way through drifts and around icy patches. They stopped once to rest the horse and eat some of the bread and cheese Duncan had packed. Hannah's cheeks were pink from the cold, but her eyes were bright with excitement. "I cannot believe I am going to get married," she said, shaking her head. "A week ago I was running for my life. Now I am about to marry the man I love. How did this happen?" "You were stubborn enough to survive," Duncan said, "and I was lucky enough to find you before the mountain killed you." "I think it was more than luck," Hannah said softly. "I think it was meant to be." Duncan was not a religious man, had stopped believing in divine plans during the war, but looking at Hannah, he could almost believe she was right. They reached Carson City as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The town was a collection of buildings sprawled in a valley, busy even in winter with miners and merchants and people trying to make their fortune in the silver boom. Duncan rode straight to the church, a small white building with a steeple that pointed toward the sky. The preacher was an older man named Reverend Thomas, with kind eyes and hands weathered from years of work. He listened to their story, or at least the parts they chose to tell, and agreed to marry them that evening. He did not ask about Hannah's previous marriage or why they were in such a hurry. He just smiled and said love was always worth celebrating. There were no guests, no flowers, no fancy clothes. Duncan and Hannah stood in the simple church with just the preacher and his wife as witnesses. But when Duncan took Hannah's hands in his and promised to love and protect her for the rest of his life, he meant every word with an intensity that shook him. And when Hannah promised to love and honor him, with tears streaming down her face, he knew she meant it just as much. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Duncan kissed Hannah with all the tenderness and passion he felt, not caring that the preacher and his wife were watching. When they finally broke apart, Hannah was laughing and crying at the same time, and Duncan felt lighter than he had in years. They spent their wedding night at the small hotel in Carson City. It was not fancy, just a simple room with a real bed and clean sheets, but it felt like luxury after the cabin. Duncan made love to his wife slowly and reverently, taking his time to worship every inch of her body, and Hannah responded with a passion that left them both breathless and satisfied. The next morning, they went to the general store and bought supplies. Duncan bought Hannah fabric for new dresses, more thread for sewing, and a good pair of scissors. He bought himself new traps and ammunition and other necessities. The storekeeper, a talkative man named Mr. Peterson, congratulated them on their marriage and gave Hannah a bag of peppermint candies as a wedding gift. As they were loading their purchases onto the horse, Duncan noticed a man watching them from across the street. He was tall and broad, with a mean look to his face and eyes that tracked Hannah with an intensity that made Duncan's instincts scream danger. When the man saw Duncan looking, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. "Did you see that man?" Duncan asked Hannah quietly. She followed his gaze, but the man was already gone. "What man?" "Big fellow, dark hair, mean-looking. He was staring at you." Hannah went pale. "What did he look like exactly?" Duncan described the man, and with each word Hannah's face lost more color. "That sounds like Marcus," she whispered. "Joseph's brother." Duncan's hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Are you sure?" "I cannot be certain without seeing him up close, but the description matches." "Duncan, what if he followed me? What if he has been looking for me this whole time?" "Then he is in for a surprise," Duncan said grimly. "You are my wife now. Legally, he has no claim on you whatsoever, and if he tries to take you, he will have to go through me first." Hannah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in. "Duncan, he is dangerous. He hurt me before when Joseph was alive, just to prove he could. He enjoys causing pain. I do not want you to get hurt because of me." Duncan covered her hand with his, gentling his voice even though rage was burning through him at the thought of anyone hurting her. "Hannah, listen to me. I have faced down armed soldiers trying to kill me. I have survived winters that killed men twice my size. I have fought bears and wolves and every kind of danger these mountains can throw at a man. One bully who likes to hurt women does not scare me. You are safe. I promise you that." She searched his face, then nodded slowly. "What do? We go home," Duncan said. "Back to the cabin. If Marcus wants to follow us up the mountain, that is his choice. But up there, on my land, with no one to hear him scream, he will regret ever laying eyes on you." They rode out of Carson City within the hour, Duncan pushing the horse harder than he normally would. He wanted to get back to the cabin, back to familiar ground where he had every advantage. The journey up the mountain was tense, with Duncan constantly watching their back trail for signs of pursuit. But if Marcus was following them, he was being careful about it. They reached the cabin as darkness was falling. Duncan helped Hannah down from the horse, then quickly unloaded their supplies and got the horse settled. He checked his weapons, loading his rifle and making sure his knives were sharp. Hannah watched him with worried eyes but did not try to stop him. "What are you going to do if he comes?" she asked. "Encourage him to leave," Duncan said, "forcefully if necessary." That night they both slept lightly, Duncan's rifle within easy reach, but no one came. The mountain was silent except for the wind and the occasional call of a night bird. By morning, Duncan was starting to think maybe he had been wrong. Maybe the man in town had just been someone who looked like Marcus. But his instincts were proven right 3 days later when he heard the sound of a horse approaching the cabin. Duncan grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, with Hannah right behind him despite his gesture for her to stay inside. Coming up the trail was the man Duncan had seen in Carson City, riding a horse that looked exhausted and underfed. Marcus Edwards was a big man, almost as tall as Duncan but carrying more weight around his middle. His face was florid and mean, with small eyes that fixed on Hannah with a look that made Duncan's trigger finger itch. He reined in his horse about 20 feet from the cabin and dismounted clumsily. "There you are, Hannah," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the space. "You have led me on quite a chase. Time to stop playing games and come home where you belong." "I am home," Hannah said, her voice shaking but strong, "and I am not going anywhere with you." Marcus's face darkened. "Joseph left you to me in his will. You are my property now, and I am tired of chasing you all over creation. Now get over here before I lose my temper." "She is not going anywhere with you," Duncan said, his voice flat and cold. "Hannah is my wife, legally married 3 days ago in Carson City. You have no claim on her." Marcus turned his attention to Duncan for the first time, really looking at him. Duncan saw the moment the other man registered his size, the rifle in his hands, and the absolute lack of fear in his eyes. Marcus tried to bluster through it. "I do not care who she tricked into marrying her. She belonged to my brother, which means she belongs to me. That is how it works." "That is not how anything works," Duncan said. "There is no law anywhere that says a man can inherit his brother's widow like livestock. You have been lied to, or you are lying to yourself, but either way you are wrong. Hannah is staying here, you are leaving. Those are your only options." Marcus's face turned an ugly shade of red. "You think you can stop me? I will go to the sheriff. I will tell him you are harboring my property." "The sheriff will tell you to go to hell," Duncan said. "Same as I am telling you now. You have 5 minutes to get back on that horse and ride out of here. After that, I stop being polite." "You cannot threaten me," Marcus snarled, taking a step forward. Duncan raised the rifle, not quite pointing it at Marcus but making the threat clear. That was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. 4 minutes now. Hannah moved closer to Duncan's side, and he felt her hand grip the back of his shirt. She was scared, but she was not cowering. She was standing her ground, trusting Duncan to protect her. That trust gave him strength. Marcus looked between them, and Duncan could see him calculating his options. He was used to intimidating people, used to getting his way through bluster and threats. But he was also smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched. Duncan stood there like a mountain himself, unmoved and immovable, and Marcus finally seemed to realize that this was a fight he would not win. "This is not over," Marcus spat. "I will be back with the law." "No, you will not," Duncan said. "Because if you come back here, or if you send anyone else, I will ride down to Carson City and tell everyone who will listen about how you tried to claim your brother's widow as property. I will tell them how you chased her into the mountains, how you tried to kidnap her. I will make sure everyone knows what kind of man you are. And then, if you are very unlucky, I will find you alone somewhere and make sure you never bother anyone again. Do you understand me?" The menace in Duncan's voice was unmistakable. This was not the threat of a civilized man bound by laws and consequences. This was the promise of someone who had survived by being harder and more dangerous than anything else on the mountain. Marcus understood that Duncan meant every word. "She is not worth all this trouble," Marcus finally muttered, climbing back on his horse with less grace than he had dismounted. "You are right about that," Duncan agreed. "She is worth far more than you could ever understand. Now get off my mountain." Marcus turned his horse and rode back down the trail, kicking the animal harder than necessary. Duncan kept the rifle ready until the man disappeared from sight, then waited another 10 minutes before finally lowering the weapon. Only then did he turn to Hannah, who was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. "He is gone," Duncan said gently, setting the rifle aside and pulling her into his arms. "He is not coming back." "How can you be sure?" Hannah asked against his chest. "Because men like Marcus are bullies. They only pick fights they think they can win. He saw that he could not win against me, and he does not care enough about you to risk his own skin. He wanted you because he thought you were property he could use, not because he actually values you. Now that he knows he cannot have you without a fight, he will move on to easier prey." Hannah shuddered. "I was so scared. When I saw him riding up, I thought he would drag me back no matter what you said." "I would die before I let that happen," Duncan said fiercely. "You are mine now, Hannah. My wife, my partner, my home, and I protect what is mine." She pulled back to look up at him, her eyes still wet but shining with love. "Your home." Duncan cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "You made my cabin a home. You made my life mean something more than just surviving. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Hannah kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude and relief into it. Duncan kissed her back just as intensely, one hand tangling in her hair while the other wrapped around her waist. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Hannah took his hand and led him back inside the cabin. The curtains she had made from old feed sacks filtered the afternoon light, casting soft patterns on the walls. The cabin smelled like the stew Hannah had made that morning and the herbs she had hung to dry. Every surface showed signs of her presence: the organized shelves, the mended clothes hanging on pegs, the blankets she had aired and folded. This was not just Duncan's cabin anymore. It was their home. They made love in the afternoon light, slow and sweet and full of promise. Afterward, lying tangled together in bed, Duncan ran his fingers through Hannah's hair and felt a contentment he had never known existed. "What are you thinking about?" Hannah asked, tracing patterns on his chest. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Duncan said. "And about how I need to build more furniture. That chair by the fire is big enough for me, but you need one that fits you properly. And we should probably build a bigger bed eventually. And maybe expand the cabin, add another room for when we have children." Hannah propped herself up on her elbow, eyes wide. "You want children? Eventually, yes. If you do, I know you just escaped one bad situation and I do not want to pressure you into anything. But someday, when you are ready, I would like to have a family with you." Hannah's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. "I would like that too. I always wanted children, but Joseph did not. He said children were expensive and annoying. But the thought of having your babies, Duncan, of building a real family with you, that sounds like everything I ever dreamed of." Duncan pulled her down into a kiss, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "Then we will have a family. But first, I am going to make you the best furniture you have ever seen, and a bigger garden in the spring, and whatever else you need to be happy." "I already have everything I need," Hannah said. "I have you." The weeks turned into months, and winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted, revealing brown earth that would soon be green again. Hannah and Duncan settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They worked together on improving the cabin, with Duncan building furniture and Hannah continuing to make the space more comfortable. She sewed new curtains for the expanded windows, made cushions for the chairs, and even braided a rug for the floor. When spring truly arrived, they planted a garden together, Hannah directing where things should go while Duncan did the heavy digging. They worked side by side in the sun, their hands dirty and their hearts light. Duncan found himself laughing more than he had in years, usually at something ridiculous Hannah said or at the way she wrinkled her nose when she disagreed with his suggestions. In May, Hannah announced she was pregnant. Duncan swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests to be careful. He was going to be a father. The thought filled him with wonder and terror in equal measure, but when he looked at Hannah's glowing face, all he felt was joy. They spent the summer preparing for the baby, with Duncan building a cradle from smooth pine and Hannah sewing tiny clothes from soft fabric she ordered from Carson City. The cabin continued to transform, becoming more and more the kind of home where a child could grow up happy and loved. On a warm evening in September, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Hannah went into labor. Duncan had faced many frightening things in his life, but nothing compared to the terror of watching his wife in pain and knowing there was nothing he could do to help. But Hannah was strong, stronger than he had given her credit for, and after hours of labor, she brought their daughter into the world. Duncan held his daughter for the first time with tears streaming down his face. She was perfect, tiny and red-faced and screaming with a thick head of dark hair like her mother. "She is beautiful," he whispered. "She looks like you," Hannah said, exhausted but smiling. "Then she got your good looks and my stubbornness. That is a dangerous combination." They named her Rose, after Hannah's mother, and Duncan fell in love all over again. He had thought his heart was full with Hannah, but adding Rose expanded it in ways he had not known were possible. He spent hours just watching her sleep, marveling at her tiny fingers and perfect features. As Rose grew, the cabin filled with new sounds, her cries and coos, her laughter when Duncan made funny faces, her squeals when Hannah sang to her. The curtains Hannah had made from old feed sacks fluttered in the breeze from open windows, filtering sunlight that fell across a home filled with love. 2 years after Rose was born, Hannah gave birth to a son they named David. He had Duncan's size even as a baby and Hannah's honey-colored eyes. Rose was fascinated by her baby brother, wanting to help with everything despite being barely old enough to walk steadily herself. Duncan built onto the cabin, adding 2 small bedrooms for the children and expanding the main living area. Hannah continued to make their home beautiful with curtains and quilts and small touches that made every space feel welcoming. The cabin that had once been a stark shelter for a solitary man had become a warm, loving home for a family. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Duncan and Hannah stood on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset while Rose and David played in the yard. Rose was 5 now, a miniature version of her mother with Duncan's stubbornness. David was 3, already showing signs of inheriting his father's size and strength. "You ever regret it?" Duncan asked, his arm around Hannah's waist. "Marrying a mountain man and living up here away from everything." Hannah looked up at him, her face soft with love. "Never, not for a single moment. This is the life I was meant to live. You are the man I was meant to love. Everything I went through before led me here to you, to this family we have built. How could I possibly regret that?" Duncan kissed her soft and sweet, the kind of kiss that held 5 years of love and the promise of 50 more. "I love you," he said against her lips. more than I thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," Hannah whispered back. "My mountain man, my home." As the sun set behind the mountains and their children's laughter filled the air, Duncan looked at the cabin that glowed with warm light from within. The curtains Hannah had made from old feed sacks still hung in some of the windows, faded now but still beautiful, a reminder of how something simple could transform everything. Those curtains had been the first sign that his cabin was becoming a home, that his life was changing in ways he could not have imagined. For the first time ever, his cabin was not just warm from the fire. It was warm with love and laughter, and the kind of happiness that only comes from building a life with someone who sees you for who you truly are and loves you anyway. Hannah had taken his cold, lonely shelter and turned it into a home. She had taken his isolated existence and filled it with purpose and joy. She had taken his guarded heart and shown him that love was worth the risk. Years continued to pass on the mountain. Rose grew into a strong-willed young woman who could shoot as well as her father, and sew as beautifully as her mother. David grew tall and broad-shouldered, with his father's love of the mountains and his mother's gentle heart. Hannah and Duncan added 2 more children to their family, another daughter named Grace and a son named Daniel. The cabin expanded again and again, eventually becoming a proper house with multiple rooms and a real fireplace in the main living area. But some things never changed. The curtains Hannah had made that first winter, faded and patched, still hung in their bedroom window. Duncan refused to let Hannah throw them away, even when she made beautiful new ones from better fabric. "These curtains represent everything," he told her when she suggested finally replacing them. "They represent you seeing possibility where I saw just empty feed sacks. They represent you making something beautiful out of nothing. They represent the day my cabin started becoming a home. They are staying right where they are." Hannah kissed him and stopped arguing, understanding that some things were more valuable than their physical beauty. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Duncan and Hannah sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Rose had married a good man from Carson City and had 3 children of her own. David had built his own cabin further down the mountain and was courting a sweet girl from town. Grace and Daniel were still at home, teenagers now, full of energy and opinions. "Can you believe it has been 20 years?" Hannah asked, her hand in Duncan's. Her dark hair was threaded with silver now, and there were lines around her eyes from years of laughing, but to Duncan, she was just as beautiful as the day he pulled her from the snow. "Best 20 years of my life," Duncan said. His hair was more gray than dark now, and his beard was fully silver, but he was still strong and capable, his body hardened by decades of mountain living. "You remember the day we met?" Hannah asked. "When you found me freezing in the snow?" "I remember thinking you were the stubbornest woman I had ever met, to be wandering through a blizzard in clothes that would not keep a dog warm," Duncan said with a smile. "I also remember thinking you were beautiful, even half frozen." "I remember being terrified," Hannah admitted. "Not of dying, but of surviving only to be dragged back to the life I was running from. And then you appeared, this huge man who looked like he could break me in half without trying, and I thought I had traded one nightmare for another. But you were so gentle. You saved my life and asked for nothing in return. You gave me choices when everyone else in my life had just taken them away. You gave me a reason to live instead of just surviving," Duncan said. "You made my house a home with nothing but some old feed sacks and thread. You showed me that I did not have to be alone just because I was safer that way. You gave me a family and a future I never thought I would have." Hannah leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Their grandchildren's laughter drifted up from the yard, and somewhere inside the house, Grace was singing while she worked on dinner. "I am so grateful I ran into that blizzard," Hannah said softly. "I am grateful for every moment that led me to you, even the hard ones. Because they brought me here to this life, to this family. I would not change a single thing." "Neither would I," Duncan agreed. "Not one thing." As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, Duncan and Hannah went inside their home. The house was warm and full of light and the sounds of family. The curtains made from old feed sacks still hung in the bedroom window, testament to a love that had started with a desperate woman, a mountain man, and the simple act of making something beautiful out of what others had discarded. The mountain remained unchanged, eternal and indifferent to the small human dramas that played out on its slopes. But in one cabin, turned house, turned home, a family thrived because a woman had seen possibility instead of limitation, and a man had chosen connection over isolation. The curtains fluttered in the evening breeze, and the mountain man's cabin remained warm, not from fire alone but from something far more enduring. Love that had been chosen freely, built carefully, and cherished completely. Hannah and Duncan lived many more happy years on their mountain. They watched all their children grow up, get married, and have families of their own. Rose's children grew up strong and capable, learning to love the mountains as their grandfather did. David became a skilled carpenter and hunter, building homes for other families while maintaining his own cabin nearby. Grace married a teacher from Carson City and opened a school in town, teaching children to read and write. Daniel took over running the expanded homestead, loving the mountain life and never wanting to leave. The house itself became something of a legend in Carson City. People talked about the mountain man who had married the widow who ran away, about the family they had built in what should have been an impossible place. Young couples just starting out would sometimes make the journey up the mountain to ask Duncan and Hannah for advice, marveling at how they had made their marriage work for so long in such isolation. Duncan always gave the same answer: "Find someone who makes you better than you are alone, then work every day to deserve them." Hannah always added, "And remember that a home is not about the walls you build, it is about the love you fill them with." On a warm summer evening, 35 years after Hannah first stumbled through the snow to Duncan's cabin, the two of them sat on their porch one last time together. Duncan was 72 now, his body finally starting to show the wear of a life lived hard but well. Hannah was 65, her dark hair completely silver but her honey eyes still bright with intelligence and love. "I am tired," Duncan admitted, something he rarely said. "My bones hurt more than they used to." "Then rest," Hannah said, taking his hand. "You have earned it, we both have." "Not yet," Duncan said. "I want to see the sunset. One more sunset with you." They watched the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors that took their breath away even after seeing it thousands of times. When the last light faded and the first stars appeared, Duncan squeezed Hannah's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything, for choosing me, for building this life with me, for making me happier than I ever thought possible." "Thank you for finding me," Hannah replied, tears streaming down her face because somehow she knew this was goodbye. "For saving me, for loving me, for giving me a home." Duncan closed his eyes, a peaceful smile on his face, and slipped away as gently as falling asleep. Hannah sat with him until David came looking for them, and even then she did not want to let go of his hand. Duncan Wright was buried on the mountain he loved, with his entire family gathered around and half the town of Carson City, making the journey to pay their respects. Hannah stood strong through it all, supported by her children and grandchildren, knowing that Duncan would want her to be strong. She lived for 5 more years after Duncan passed, staying in the house they had built together. Her children wanted her to move to town, to somewhere easier and more comfortable, but Hannah refused. "This is my home," she told them firmly. "Your father and I built it together, and this is where I belong." She spent those 5 years surrounded by family, telling stories about Duncan to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She taught them all to sew, showing them how to make something beautiful out of simple materials. She kept the house exactly as it had been, including the faded curtains made from feed sacks that still hung in the bedroom window. On the morning of her 70th birthday, Hannah did not wake up. She died peacefully in her sleep, in the bed she had shared with Duncan for 35 years, with sunlight filtering through the curtains she had made so long ago. Her children found her with a smile on her face, and they knew she had gone to join the man she loved. Hannah Edwards Wright was buried next to Duncan on the mountain, overlooking the valley below. The house remained in the family, passed down through generations, with each new generation adding their own touches while preserving the original cabin that Duncan had built and Hannah had transformed. The curtains made from old feed sacks stayed in place for 50 years, carefully preserved behind glass as a family treasure. They represented the foundation of everything the Wright family became, a simple act of creativity and hope that transformed not just a cabin but an entire life. They reminded each generation that home was not about having the finest things, but about making something beautiful and meaningful out of whatever you had. People in Carson City still tell the story of the mountain man and the runaway widow, of how they found each other in a blizzard and built a love that lasted through everything life threw at them. They talk about the curtains made from feed sacks, about how something so simple became a symbol of love and transformation. But the real legacy Duncan and Hannah left was not a story or a house or even curtains. It was their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a sprawling family tree rooted in love and choice, and the simple courage it took to build something good out of difficult circumstances. It was the knowledge that home was not a place but a feeling, not walls but warmth, not isolation but connection. The mountain remained, as mountains do, eternal and unchanging. But the cabin that Duncan built and Hannah transformed continued to stand, generation after generation, a testament to what two people could create when they chose love over fear, connection over isolation, and hope over despair. The curtains might have faded, but the warmth they represented never did. The mountain man's cabin remained warm, for the first time ever and for all the times that followed, because of a woman who saw possibility in old feed sacks and a man who saw possibility in love. And in that warmth, in that home built on a mountainside by two people who refused to let their circumstances define them, the legacy of Duncan and Hannah Wright lived on, a story of survival and transformation, and the enduring power of love freely chosen and carefully cherished. It was a story told around firesides and dinner tables, passed down through generations, a reminder that the simplest acts of creativity and kindness could change everything. The curtains made from old feed sacks had transformed a cabin into a home. The love between Duncan and Hannah had transformed two damaged, lonely people into partners who built something extraordinary. And together, they had proved that warmth came not from fire or shelter, but from the courage to open your heart and let someone else in, to choose love even when it was risky, and to build something beautiful even when you had almost nothing to start with. That was the true story of the mountain man's cabin, of the curtains made from feed sacks, and of the warmth that filled those walls for the first time ever and then never left. It was a story of love, pure and simple, the kind that transforms everything it touches and leaves the world better than it found it. It was a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth holding close on cold nights when you needed to remember that warmth was always possible if you were brave enough to create it. And so the story ended, as all good stories do, with love triumphant and a family thriving and a home that remained warm long after the people who built it were gone. The mountain stood watch over it all, bearing witness to the small miracle of two people who found each other in a blizzard and built something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. The curtains fluttered in windows now tended by great-grandchildren, who had never met Duncan and Hannah but who knew their story by heart. And the warmth continued, generation after generation, a legacy of love that would never fade as long as someone remembered to tell the tale of the mountain man, the runaway widow, and the curtains made from old feed sacks that changed everything.